From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. On the point about the green energy transition and cold weather, Alicia, your column today under the headline, Not So Fast on Electric Cars, has some interesting information about how their range is affected by a cold snap.
This is an aspect of the electric vehicle quote-unquote transition that I don't think is well appreciated, but perhaps, people in very cold climates, such as Alaska or Maine, have seen who have electric vehicles, is that when temperatures drop, the batteries are much less efficient. They get a lot less than their quoted range, and it takes actually a lot longer to recharge the batteries. So, for example, actually, there's a site that you can go plug in different temperatures and different car models and see what the range is. And for one example, when temperatures dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which was about where it was actually in many places of the country this last weekend, even those that have more moderate temperate weather like Texas, the cars only achieved about 54% of their quoted range. So a car that on average that's supposed to go about 250 miles between charges, and that's about more typical of the EVs that are being produced nowadays, will only go about 135 miles on average. Or a Tesla Model 3, which is the most popular EV in the US, at 32 degrees, if you think you're going to get 282 miles and you're driving and you're perhaps making a road trip like over the holidays to visit relatives, especially, in a rural area, and you're thinking you're going to start out and you'll get 282 miles and you're trying to map out, where are the chargers, which is what a lot of people who have EVs do when they're taking trips. And then all of a sudden they discovered and see they're in the middle of nowhere and they're about to lose battery. And unlike with gas, where you can actually, bring along, spare fuel, you're basically reliant on AAA or, a tow truck to then rescue you. We actually saw that a little bit. There was a case when it got really cold in Virginia a year or so ago where EVs were just basically they lost power when there was a traffic jam and a really bad weather. And this is going to be one impediment in the EV transition. A lot of people in these colder climates are going to be more reluctant to buy EVs if they have to, make any kind of, travel any sort of distance. Now, I got some readers saying, well, most people don't have to go even 173 miles on a charge, but, a lot of people do make road trips and you don't want to have to buy a second car. Most people can't afford to buy a second car or rent a different car, like a gas-fueled vehicle, when they want to go out and visit family.
And even if it's a low percentage of people who are taking those trips, there are a lot of Americans on the roads. There's some AAA numbers from December. They estimated 113 million people will travel 50 miles or more away from home during the December holidays. And so even if a fraction of those people end up not getting the range they expected and pulling into a charging station, by the way, at the same time that the grid operator is begging people not to use their dishwashers because they're worried about having to impose rolling blackouts to keep the grid operating efficiently, it seems like we're just compounding this problem. And then, Kim, the question about where you find a station is part of what is driving the Biden administration to insist that there's this build-out of electric vehicle charging stations. And I still suspect that a lot of that is going to end up stranded. They'll be built with old technologies that are obsolete by the time that the average American has an electric car, or they're built in places that don't end up getting used, or they end up getting broken. I think there are a lot of news stories in the years to come that we will be seeing how this electric charging station build-out actually functions in practice.
Yeah, this is what I really wish the climate lobby would simply acknowledge, is that if you live in an urban area, there might be a great deal of sense for you getting an electric vehicle. Traveling short distances, there are ways to deal with the problem if for some reason you run out of a charge. You plug your car in overnight. The temperatures are pretty good, especially in places like California, which is where we've seen EVs flourish more than anywhere else. And there's a reason for that. It largely is the weather and the urban environment that have combined in some places to make those an obvious choice for a number of Americans. But why can't they also acknowledge that there are great numbers of Americans who do live in very different environments for which EVs are just a really silly idea? And part of it, as Alicia just explained, is the cold weather and what that does to the batteries. And by the way, that is also an issue, not just for Maine or Alaska, but for parts of Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, upper Michigan. There's a lot of places get really cold in the winter where these just don't make a lot of sense. But then there is, as you note, Kyle, the rural problem, which is there are a lot of people for whom driving 50, 60, 80 miles a day to even get from home to work is not necessarily a bizarre idea. They do it routinely. And a lot of these places are rural strips of roads or areas where who's going to build a charging station there and how often is it going to get used? And Alicia's column is amazing. It kind of goes through some of the complaints and problems that the states have been throwing up back to the Biden administration in response to these grants that the administration was handing out to build out the charging network, noting that it's very likely that maybe some private companies would come in when there was a lot of federal cash rolling around to build these stations, but given how little they will be used in rural areas, they're likely to become abandoned over time. If not run by private actors, the state might have to try to step in and run some of these with all of the very heavy costs associated, which will grow even more when the federal government dollars run out after the first few years. And as it is, there have been some great studies showing that even the technology we have now at a bunch of these charging stations is faulty, broken down. There are EV charging stations, even in really heavy urban areas where many of them are not usable. Now imagine what that would look like if you were trying to build one in the middle of rural Nebraska and see how much attention is paid to keeping that up and running. So there's all of these really practical problems which nobody is publicly acknowledging. And yet at the same time, we are rushing along suggesting that at some point here we are going to phase out all gas combustion engines. It's simply ludicrous.
But one notable piece of skepticism comes from Akio Toyoda, the CEO of Toyota. And he said recently, just like the fully autonomous cars that we were all supposed to be driving by now, I think battery electric vehicles are just going to take longer to become mainstream than the media would like us to believe. And he also said that this is a view shared by a silent majority in the auto industry, but that majority is pretty quiet because they know that this is the trend, the way that things seem to be going. Alicia, do you agree with that? And maybe this range question is part of what is driving the CEO of Toyota to say that.
I think so. I mean, some readers mentioned that Toyota has also invested a lot in hybrids, which are great cars, and has put those over EVs, and those aren't as heavily subsidized. But you know what? They've actually been more popular because they don't have these downsides. If they run out of juice, they can continue to run. I think what they're looking at, Toyota and others, they were basically required by a lot of these countries, the US and others, either fuel economy mandates and other regulations to produce more and more electric vehicles. And so in some ways, they have no choice but to do so. And I think one of the reasons why they're hyping all these up is because they need to sell these EVs. And so they're not going to talk about the downsides because they don't, want to steer off potential customers and people who will buy them. And I think they also don't want to anger their regulators. Like Mary Barra, I don't think there's been anyone who's been a more successful lobbyist in Shill than GM CEO Mary Barra. And you can look at just the evidence from the Inflation Reduction Act and how many subsidies are just thrown at this industry there. And that's because that's the only way that these cars could ever get mainstream. And you'd have to subsidize basically the hell out of them. But not only that, if you go back to the Norway example, also heavily tax gas-powered cars. And that's really the secret, the reason why EVs have really taken off in Norway is because, even now, like gas prices are averaging in Norway around $7.50 per gallon because of all the taxes they add on and layer on for fuel. There's also another 25% tax or VAT on gas-powered cars that isn't imposed on EVs. And so this just ends up being an income shift to transfer payments, essentially to buyers of EVs, which, by the way, are usually more higher income from those who drive and buy gas-powered cars. And so I don't want to say like EVs are bad. They have a lot of potential, but it's just going to take a little longer probably perhaps decades longer for the technology, to Kim's point, the logistics to get worked out. And I don't think government should be putting its thumb on the scale and basically banning gas-powered cars or heavily subsidizing EVs or taxing the gas-powered cars in order to achieve this, its quote-unquote climate goals, which, by the way, even if they basically banning gas-powered cars in the US and Europe would have absolutely almost no impact on global warming.